There's a story people tell themselves when they can't buy a house. It's one of greedy boomers, corporations, low wages, and a rigged system. And you know what? Parts of that story are true. I'll even admit boomers are to blame for most of it. But that's not the full story. A story that's harder to hear because it puts the responsibility on the younger generations. Millennials, Gen Z, and soon Gen Alpha. It starts with a simple question every time you make a purchase. Did my parents, or grandparents, have something like this when they were my age? Or at least an equivalent that they spent money on and still managed to buy a home? More and more often, the answer is no. The things we treat as normal today, the size of our homes, how often we eat out, how quickly we replace our phones and clothes, the constant stream of subscriptions and conveniences, everything that embodies our quality of life in the year of our Lord 2026, these weren't the baseline when boomers or Gen X were starting out. They were the standard the parents of the younger generations eventually reached after they bought a home, after they started a family, after they had already built some stability. So why do the younger gens regard such frivolities as necessary expenditures? Is it because they're like the ex-wife to a rich man, divorced, yet accustomed to a certain standard of living that they simply cannot live without, demanding alimony so that they can maintain that baseline quality of life that can only be fulfilled by an all-electric Ferrari with a trunk of caviar, yet they are not so lucky to be blessed by the courts with alimony and so they suffer? And who do they blame but the rich man, the patriarchy, who cast them out of their marital bed and back onto the streets from whence they came? Wait, where was I? The older generations were simply born during times more conducive to wealth building, and their kids were along for the tail end of that ride. A comfortable ride, but one that is not sustainable for the average person starting their adult life. If we accept that younger people are getting priced out of their homes because a starter home costs, on average, double what they did for boomers, adjusted for inflation of course, then they also have to be honest about the fact that what is considered a starter home today is double the size of what boomers were buying and packed with more amenities. If they want to blame boomers for housing regulations that effectively made starter homes illegal to build, then they have to be honest that many people looking to buy simply wouldn't be interested in a shack anyway. Because here's the uncomfortable truth I want to lay out. A significant part of why many feel priced out of home ownership isn't just that prices went up, is that their expectations went up faster than their willingness to live below the standard they grew up with. There is an undeniable structural problem that does make housing more untenable than it once was. It's really more a matter of supply than it is price. After all, if demand growth outpaces supply growth, then price has to increase as well. But what is causing the supply issue? Well, it's the same reason we live in a suburban hell, paving over paradise
Wait, that's what the paved over paradise guy looks like? Huh.
one subdivision at a time for more than half a century now. Zoning. Specifically, zoning for single-family housing. In the US, 75% of residential land is exclusively zoned for single-family housing, R1 zoning, the most expensive residential zoning. To put things in perspective, around 30% of German and 20% of UK housing is exclusively single-family. Besides the zoning, you have regulations that make multifamily housing difficult to build, like height restrictions in most suburbs which limit the scale of what limited multifamily housing is allowed. You have regulations requiring 1 to 2 parking spaces per apartment unit, others requiring 2 stairways for buildings 2 or more stories tall, elevators for anything taller, and the matter of government approvals taking years longer for an apartment building than for a subdivision. All of these raise costs, limit the number of apartment units built, or push developers to build subdivisions instead. Even the single-family housing available is a problem because building regulations in many areas of the US effectively ban the small basic starter homes built in the 50s and 60s that the boomers would later buy in the 70s to start families in. There's a reason homes are getting bigger and bigger, and part of it is that the smaller ones may be illegal. Why, you ask? Regulations, of course. Minimum lot size and minimum floor area requirements reduce density and encourage the building of bigger homes, effectively outlawing smaller 1,000-square-foot homes that used to be starters. And let's not forget modern building codes, which yes, serve the vital purpose of safety, but some regarding energy efficiency and insulation requirements, accessibility and safety rules, and foundation and structural requirements all raise the baseline cost of homes in ways that make small homes less practical to build. Look, I'm not saying cut all the regulations, but if all someone can afford is a shack, or a dystopian apartment hovel in a 40K hive city, but you make these things illegal to build, then that person becomes homeless. And that is the world we live in, at least in the West, where quality of life regulations force people onto the streets. The government, in all their infinite wisdom, wants you to have either a good quality of life or no quality of life at all, because when these regulations were made, supposedly with all the best intentions, the government never thought about how people would afford this standard of living in the first place. Now, to be fair, boomers did not in fact create all of these regulations. It was partly them and partly silent generation regulations that boomers fervently defended. As a relatively young sleep paralysis demon, I remember 1920s New York like it was yesterday. Immigrants were packed like sardines, 20 to a flat. Was it great? No, not really, but many of those immigrants would go on to become great people, like Frank Sinatra and Irving Berlin. Great music, those two. And if they could do it, why couldn't the youth of today? Well, besides such cramped housing being illegal now, young people today probably wouldn't want to live immigrant style, as we used to say, because of the last factor we can blame the older generations for. A cultural shift that started in the long ago and culminated in the concept of the nuclear family, a shift that is slowly reversing course but only after significant damage. The fact is that in the West, but especially the United States, we moved away from living arrangements that used to make living more affordable. In many other cultures, multiple generations often live together or very close. That means shared housing costs, shared cooking, and built-in childcare. We shifted heavily towards the nuclear family model, where each household carries the full load alone. That change removed a lot of the natural efficiencies that used to keep the cost of living lower. But the idea of the nuclear family is not the norm. In all of the world, in many traditional cultures, like that of Eastern Europe, the Middle East, or Southeast Asia, multi-generational living is the norm, and also logical. So yes, the younger generations were screwed over by boomers, but they don't bear the blame alone. To properly allocate blame and calculate your victim score, we have to first consider what was normal for a boomer starting a family back in the day. So what did normal actually look like when the parents or grandparents of the younger generations were young adults just starting out? In the 1970s, when many boomers were in their 20s and early 30s, getting married, having their first kid, and buying their first home, the typical starter house was modest, often around 1,000 square feet, usually with 2 or 3 bedrooms and 1 bathroom. Central air conditioning was becoming more common in newer suburban builds, but was still a luxury for many. Dishwashers were increasingly available, but far from universal. Color televisions were starting to become more standard, but microwaves were rare, costing around $3,000 in today's future money. Most young couples started with 1 car. 2 cars was an upgrade that came later. Food was cooked at home from basic ingredients the vast majority of the time. Eating out was something you did occasionally, maybe once a week or less for most young families. Clothing was more expensive but bought less often and expected to last. Entertainment meant watching a few channels on a color TV, listening to records or the radio, or going to the movies. And here's the part that matters. A typical first home often cost around 3 to 4 times the median household income. In many parts of the US, it was even lower. That meant a single income could realistically cover the mortgage on a young couple's first house, while still leaving some room to save and build from there. This wasn't some golden age of universal prosperity. The 1970s brought stagflation, oil shocks, and periods of high interest rates, sometimes up to 18%, that made buying difficult for a lot of young people. Plenty of couples struggled or had to wait longer than they wanted, but the baseline, the default expectations for what starting out meant was dramatically lower than what most of us treat as normal today. When boomers were in their 20s and early 30s, they weren't starting with the house size, the number of cars, the constant upgrades, or the level of convenience we now treat as standard. They built up to those things over time and while raising their kids, who would see what culminated from decades of hard work and then want that for themselves. Necessity creep is the gradual expansion of what people consider a basic or normal standard of living over time. Things that were once luxuries, optional, or completely non-existent for previous generations become treated as minimum requirements for the next generations. Housing is the most obvious example. Today we have bigger houses with bigger kitchens, more bathrooms, and features that used to be considered upgrades. Regulations and zoning aside, the product itself got bigger and more expensive, and the smaller ones largely disappeared from new construction. Food changed too. Today, a significant portion of food spending goes to restaurants, takeout, processed or pre-prepared food that actually costs considerably more than cooking for yourself. This is another spot where multi-generational living helps because you can share cooking labor, usually from grandparents, which keeps the cost and time of home cooking lower. Clothing shows this pattern clearly as well. Fast fashion made individual pieces much cheaper than they used to be, but instead of spending less overall, many households simply buy more items and replace them faster. If you break down the data, yes, we do spend less on clothing now than in the past. Since 1950, the amount the average household spent on clothing dropped by only 10%, even though the price of clothing crashed almost 70%. Technology and daily conveniences follow the same path. A basic smartphone is now effectively a necessity for work, banking, and communication. I get that, but the constant cycle of upgrades and premium models are simply unnecessary for some. The same thing happened to cars in almost every facet of life because all these things were normal for boomers, older Gen X, and while growing up for the younger generations, they became the standard the younger gens would want to live their own lives by. They weren't forced on anyone. They were slowly accepted as normal, and after that, going back to a lower baseline starts to feel like deprivation instead of choice. This is what I mean by necessity creep. It's not just that we want more stuff, it's that the floor, the minimum we think we need to live a decent life, keeps moving upward, and every time it moves, it takes more income to stay at the same place. The parents of the younger generations didn't start at this level. They grew into it, which means that the younger gens need to grow into it as well. And for that to happen, they need to dial back their expectations and live more simple lives. So for this portion of the video, I was going to crunch the numbers for various examples of Gen Z and millennial living to show how decent chunks of money could be saved and put towards a down payment for a house. But like Neo seeing the Matrix for the first time, I could see the holes. Everyone's life is different, and it's impossible to generalize in a way that is truly relatable. So instead, I'm going to talk about two things: the goal and the philosophy that needs to be adopted if the younger gens want to reach it. So the goal, homeownership. And I think this is specifically where a lot of people get hung up. Yes, homes are crazy expensive. Yes, homes were a lot cheaper not long ago. Let's move past that for a moment and deal in the now, because otherwise we risk becoming fatalistic and giving up. This is where we can fall in the trap of seeing cheap luxuries as acceptable in the context of the larger expense of home ownership. The thing is, you don't need to buy a home flat out, big suitcase of cash on the table. You just need a little down payment and the ability to cover the mortgage, which, look, if you've been paying rent, then you can probably make the mortgage payment, with those life changes we'll talk about, since the average monthly mortgage payment is around $500 to $700 more than the average monthly rent, for new homeowners at least. Nothing to laugh at. I get that, trust me. But once you reduce the goal to the down payment, suddenly those luxuries don't seem so cheap, and home ownership won't seem so out of reach. Your non-existent accountant will tell you I'm stupid for saying that, but I think of it as focusing yourself, taking one step at a time. Again, you still need to be able to manage those monthly payments too. Don't forget those. Pay extra when you can, maintain a savings account, eat your veggies, and all of that. As for the philosophy, live simpler lives. Don't fall victim to unending consumerism. That's what got us in this mess to begin with. Look at the excess of boomers and Gen X. The ocean of self-storage facilities taking over our cities. You don't want to be like them. You can call the companies evil all you want, but almost everyone feeds the beast anyway. Control what you can, your own life, your own consumption. Consumers have so much power. All they need is some unity, and they could force changes the government would have to fight an army of lobbyists just to think about. But forget the big picture politics and focus on yourself, your own realm, and the balance that will bring it harmony. Because even consumerism isn't the enemy. Imbalance is. Excess is. And it starts with you. When we spend all of our energy blaming boomers, corporations, low wages, or the system, we protect ourselves from having to look at our own choices. It feels better to be a victim of circumstance than to admit we got comfortable with a higher standard of living than we can afford. The truth is, both things can be true at the same time. Housing supply is restricted in many places because of bad policy. Prices have risen faster than incomes in a lot of markets. I mean, from 1970 to 2020, the age of the average first-time homeowner was around 30 to 33. Then, by 2025, it went up to 40. Lord have mercy. These are legitimate problems, but using them as a total explanation becomes a way to avoid responsibility. The longer we all stay in victim mode, the longer we stay stuck. Because victimhood is comfortable. It lets us keep our current spending habits while blaming external forces for the consequences. Self-actualization, on the other hand, is uncomfortable. It requires looking at what we're actually spending money on and being willing to change it, even when it feels like everyone else is living their best life, child-free and drowning in Funko Pops. Those luxurious Funko Pops, however, will never fill the void inside of you. The people who build real stability are usually the ones willing to live below the standard their parents eventually reached, or at least for a while. They treat the baseline as something they get to define, not something they're entitled to inherit. Like Elon Musk, when he lived in a modest $10 million Cape Town mansion instead of his mining tycoon's parents' $50 million Johannesburg mansion. Okay, I made all of that up. I have no idea. But the guy does currently live in what I consider a shack. I made a video on it. Go check it out. Either way, blaming external factors for our current housing crisis is factually correct. But that mentality doesn't build wealth, it doesn't build discipline, and it doesn't get you closer to the life you actually want. The question was never about whether the game is fair. It never was and never will be. But at some point you have to decide whether you'd rather be right about why it's hard and stay frustrated, or actually do something about it and decide to set your own baseline for living, even if it's lower than what your parents eventually reached. That decision won't fix the housing market, but it will change what's possible for you. The question is, what are you going to choose? As usual, leave a comment telling me how I'm wrong, give the video a like, and please subscribe and check out my other videos. The editing alone takes the blood, sweat, and tears of many gypsies, and they would really appreciate it.